She looked me in the eye that evening and said, "I may be lonely, but I'm not helpless." I didn't know then how deeply those words would stay with me, or how much they would change the way I saw her. I first saw her on an ordinary evening, the kind of day that passes without fanfare, where the air is cooling after the sun dips low and the town seems to fold in on itself, settling into quiet. I was at the grocery store, standing in a dimly lit aisle debating which bread to buy, when I noticed her. She moved with a grace that drew my eyes before I even realized what I was doing. A woman in her early 40s, tall, her dark hair tied back in a loose knot at the base of her neck. There was something in the way she carried herself, a steadiness, a quiet command of her own space. She wasn't the type to look around for help, not the type to stumble or hesitate. Even so, I found myself watching as she balanced 2 heavy paper bags against her hip and tried to reach for a third. Instinct made me step forward. "Let me get that for you," I offered, my hand half raised. She turned toward me, her eyes catching the last bit of golden light spilling through the store's front windows. There was kindness in them, yes, but also something unflinching. A calm strength that made me stop in my tracks. Then she smiled, polite but firm, and shook her head. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I've got it." Her voice was smooth, a little husky, like someone who had lived and endured and didn't want sympathy for it. Still, I couldn't help hovering, just in case. The bag looked heavy, straining against her grip. But she adjusted it, straightened her back, and managed it with an ease that seemed practiced. That was when she looked at me again, almost amused by my hesitation, and said the words that would stay with me far longer than I expected. "I may be lonely," she said, her tone neither defensive nor apologetic. "But I'm not helpless." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Her honesty caught me off guard. It wasn't self-pity, and it wasn't pride, it was simply truth, stated with a strength that silenced the part of me that wanted to argue. I stepped back, nodding. "Of course." And yet, as I watched her walk away with those bags, her figure framed by the fading orange of the sunset through the glass doors, I realized there was something about her that unsettled me, not in a bad way, but in a way that made me want to know more. There was dignity in her solitude. A kind of beauty in the fact that she asked for nothing, yet carried so much. And though I left the store that evening with nothing more than bread in my hands, I carried her words with me. Words that were firm, unshaken, yet laced with a quiet confession: she was alone. And that, somehow, mattered to me more than I wanted to admit. After that first evening in the grocery store, I told myself I'd probably never see her again. It's a small town, yes, but life has a way of scattering people across routines, and I figured she and I were just 2 lines that happened to cross once. But life, as it turns out, had other plans. The next time I saw her was at the library. I'd gone in to return a dog-eared novel and maybe find something new, and there she was, standing in the quiet history aisle, her hand brushing over the spines as if she were listening to the books instead of reading their titles. She didn't notice me at first. Her expression was thoughtful, distant, as though her mind was miles away. I almost turned back, but something made me clear my throat softly, a kind of unspoken hello. She glanced over her shoulder. That same composed presence. But this time, when her eyes landed on me, there was recognition, the smallest flicker of surprise, quickly softened by a smile that seemed warmer than the first. "Oh, grocery store," she said gently, like she was placing me in her memory. I smiled back. "Yeah. The bread guy." It was nothing, just a shared joke in the hush of the library, but it settled between us like a thread tying 2 separate days together. From then on, it seemed I kept running into her, at the cafe on Main Street where she ordered tea and read quietly by the window, at the corner shop when she was picking up fresh flowers, once even in the park as she sat on a bench, watching the leaves drift down like slow rain. Always ordinary moments, yet each one seemed to gather weight, as if the universe was nudging me closer. One afternoon I noticed her scarf slip from her bag as she stood to leave the cafe. A light, woven thing the color of soft cream. I picked it up and caught her just as she was heading out. "You dropped this," I said, holding it out. Her fingers brushed mine when she took it, just for a second. Nothing more than skin against skin, warm and fleeting. But in that moment, I felt an unexpected rush, like a spark of electricity that was gone before I could name it. She seemed to feel it too, because her eyes lifted to mine, and for the first time, she didn't look away right away. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice was quieter than before, and there was something softer in it, not weakness, but a gentleness I hadn't heard yet. It was such a small thing, returning a scarf. A gesture that shouldn't have mattered. Yet I walked home that evening with the faint scent of her perfume still lingering on my hand, and the image of her half-smile replaying in my mind. They were little encounters, chance meetings that might mean nothing to anyone else. But to me, each one felt like a door opening, just a crack, enough to let in a little more light each time. It was the rain that brought me to her door. The storm came suddenly, the kind that rolls in heavy and unannounced. I had just stepped out of the corner shop when the sky opened, drenching the street in sheets of water. My jacket did little to help, and by the time I rounded the block, I was half soaked, carrying groceries that felt heavier by the second. That's when I saw her. She was ahead of me on the sidewalk, balancing her own paper bags as the wind tugged at her hair. For a moment I hesitated, remembering her words from the grocery store. "I may be lonely, but I'm not helpless." But when one of her bags shifted dangerously, I couldn't stop myself. I jogged up beside her, holding my hand out. "Here, let me carry one at least." No arguments this time. She turned her face toward me, raindrops streaking across her cheekbones, her eyes catching mine with that same firm steadiness. But this time, she let out a breath that sounded almost like laughter, and she nodded. "All right," she said softly. "Just one." So I walked beside her, a bag in my arm, the rain hammering down as we made our way up the narrow street. By the time she reached her front gate, we were both soaked, our clothes clinging to us, hair dripping. She unlocked the door quickly and stepped inside, then paused, glancing back at me. "You'll catch cold," she said. "Come in, at least until it eases." I don't know what surprised me more, her invitation, or the fact that she said it so naturally, as if it wasn't a big decision. I hesitated only a second before following her into the warmth of her home. The first thing I noticed was the light. A soft amber glow from a lamp by the window, casting warmth over everything, the shelves of books, the framed photographs, the vase of fresh flowers on the table. The second thing I noticed were the traces of someone else. A man's jacket still hung by the door, untouched, perhaps years old. A picture on the mantel showed her standing beside him, smiling, younger, yet recognizably the same woman I'd just followed in from the storm. She set her groceries down, brushing damp strands of hair from her face, and for the first time, she looked almost vulnerable. Not weak, never weak, but human, tired in a way that went deeper than rain. "Sit," she said gently, motioning toward the table. She moved into the kitchen, the sound of a kettle soon filling the silence. I sat, still dripping, my eyes wandering around the room. Everything about it felt lived in, but also suspended, like time had stopped here, waiting for her to breathe life back into it. When she returned, she placed a steaming cup of tea in front of me. The scent of chamomile rose with the steam, warm and calming. She sat across from me, her fingers curled lightly around her own cup, and for a moment, we just listened to the rain outside. There was no grand gesture, no sudden shift. Just the quiet reality of being invited into her space, her world. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of something I hadn't expected, but couldn't bring myself to walk away from. The storm outside had settled into a steady rhythm, the kind of rain that quiets a town until it feels like the whole world has drawn its curtains. Inside her kitchen, though, it was warm, lamplight glowing across the pale wood table, the soft hiss of the kettle cooling behind us. She sat across from me, hands wrapped loosely around her cup of tea. I noticed how her fingers lingered on the ceramic, as if holding on to its warmth gave her a reason to stay present. Her eyes were steady, but there was a tiredness behind them, a heaviness I hadn't seen before. "You live here long?" I asked softly, unsure if silence was safer. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Most of my life. Moved away for a little while in my 20s, but this town has a way of pulling people back. I nodded, waiting. And then she surprised me. She didn't change the subject, didn't brush me off the way someone might with a stranger. Instead, she took a slow sip of tea, set her cup down, and said quietly, "Nights are the hardest." Her voice wasn't shaky. It wasn't broken. It was calm, as if she had rehearsed this truth many times but rarely spoken it aloud. I felt my chest tighten. She went on. "It's not the chores, or the work, or even the quiet dinners. Those I've learned to manage. But when the house gets too still at night." She looked past me, toward the darkened window, her eyes reflecting the faint shimmer of rain. "The silence has a way of pressing in. It makes the walls feel closer. It makes me notice what's missing." I didn't know if she meant to say so much, or if the storm had loosened something in her. I didn't move, didn't interrupt. I simply let her words linger between us. Finally, she looked back at me, studying my face as if expecting pity. But pity was the last thing I felt. What I saw was strength, a woman carrying grief not because she was helpless, but because she refused to let it define her. "I don't need anyone to fix it," she said softly, almost firmly. "I just, sometimes need someone to understand it." I nodded, my voice quiet but certain. "I do." The clock ticked steadily on the wall, filling the pause that followed. She held my gaze a second longer than before. Something unspoken passed between us, not romance, not yet, but recognition. A fragile thread of trust tying her world to mine, however briefly. She reached for her cup again, and as she did, her hand brushed the edge of the table near mine. It wasn't deliberate, I don't think. But I felt the warmth of her presence so close, and I didn't pull away. In that moment, I realized it wasn't my job to rescue her. She had made that clear from the beginning. What she allowed me to offer was something smaller, but maybe more important: quiet company in a space that had been empty for too long. And that felt like the most fragile, precious thing in the world. For a while, it felt almost easy. We didn't make plans, but somehow our paths kept crossing. A morning nod at the cafe, a wave across the library stacks, even a few evenings spent talking quietly in her kitchen while the world outside slipped into night. These were not grand gestures, but they had begun to feel like anchors in my week. Then came the whispers. In a small town, people notice. They don't have to see much, just enough. A woman in her 40s, a man barely past 25, lingering too long in conversation, walking side by side on the street, carrying groceries together. It didn't take much for rumors to find their way into corners where they didn't belong. I heard it first at the hardware store, two men talking carelessly as I passed. They didn't say her name, but they didn't have to. The words were sharp enough, mocking enough, that I felt the blood rise in my cheeks. I wanted to turn, to defend her, to shut them down. But something held me back, a voice in my head whispering that confronting them would only feed the fire. The next time I saw her, I noticed the change immediately. She still smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her words were polite, restrained, almost rehearsed. When I suggested we sit together at the cafe, she declined with a soft, "Maybe another time." It stung, more than I expected. But I understood. She had more to lose than I did. Her life here was rooted, layered with history, with the memory of her late husband, with neighbors who remembered her before I ever came along. I was new, temporary in their eyes, someone who could leave without consequence. Still, the distance she placed between us hurt. I saw her in the market one afternoon. She was reaching for apples, her posture poised as always. Our eyes met, but instead of the warmth that had begun to grow there, she gave me only a polite nod, the kind reserved for acquaintances. Nothing more. I nodded back, forcing myself to respect the boundaries she was drawing. But the silence between us felt heavier than words. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, replaying the last few weeks. The laughter we had shared in her kitchen, the way her voice softened when she spoke of quiet nights, the brief brush of her hand against mine. None of it had been imagined, it had been real. And yet, it seemed fragile, threatened not by us, but by the world watching from the outside. I realized then that patience would have to be my choice. If she needed space, if she needed to protect herself from the judgment of others, I couldn't take that away from her. All I could do was be steady, constant, a presence she could return to if she wanted. And so, though it hurt to see her pull away, I told myself to wait. Because something in her eyes, even behind the distance, told me this wasn't the end. Autumn settled over the town slowly, layering the streets with amber leaves and crisp winds that carried the smell of wood smoke. Days had grown shorter, and so had our conversations. She had been holding herself at a distance for weeks now, careful not to linger too long, careful not to give the neighbors more to talk about. I told myself I understood. Still, there was an ache every time I saw her look away when our eyes met, as though she was protecting us both from something unspoken. One evening, after a long day of work, I was walking home when I saw her. She was kneeling in her front garden, pruning the last of the fading flowers before the frost came. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, but she wore only a light sweater, her shoulders hunched slightly, her movements sharper than usual. I hesitated at the edge of the path. Part of me wanted to keep walking, to respect the space she'd drawn between us. But there was something in the slope of her shoulders, the way she paused mid-motion, that made me stop. "Evening," I said softly. She looked up, startled. For a moment, I thought she might dismiss me with a polite smile again. But her eyes glistened in the porch light, and I saw something I hadn't seen before, not anger, not distance, but exhaustion. The kind that doesn't come from work, but from carrying too much alone. I stepped closer, keeping my voice low. "Are you all right?" She drew in a shaky breath, setting her clippers aside. "I'm fine," she said automatically, then closed her eyes as if the words tasted bitter. "No, I'm not." There it was, the crack. The truth she had fought to keep hidden. Before I could say anything, she stood, brushing her hands against her sweater, and shook her head. "It's just, they keep talking. My sister, the neighbors, even people I barely know. They think I'm foolish. That I'm clinging to something I shouldn't." Her voice trembled, but only slightly. She was still holding herself together, even now. I didn't try to argue, didn't try to tell her they were wrong. Instead, I took the last step toward her slowly, so she could stop me if she wanted. She didn't. Her breath caught as I reached out, resting my hand gently against her shoulder. For a heartbeat, I felt the tension there, tight, unyielding, then it softened under my touch. She let out a breath, one that shook as it left her, and before I knew it, she leaned forward. Her forehead brushed my chest first, then her cheek, until she was resting against me. I wrapped my arms carefully around her, not too tight, just enough to hold her there if she chose to stay. Her heartbeat was quick at first, then steadied, syncing with mine in the quiet. I didn't say anything. Words felt clumsy compared to the simplicity of being here, letting her rest, letting her know she wasn't alone. My hand brushed through a strand of hair that had fallen loose, tucking it gently behind her ear. She stayed there longer than I expected, long enough for the cold air to settle around us, long enough for me to know this wasn't about defiance or appearances anymore. It was about trust, fragile, tentative, but real. When she finally stepped back, her eyes met mine, steady now. "Thank you," she whispered. And in that small moment, I knew the wall between us had cracked for good. The first light of dawn always carries a certain stillness, as if the world hasn't quite woken yet. That morning, I found myself sitting beside her on the porch steps of her house, wrapped in the hush of a sky slowly changing color. The storm of the night before had passed, leaving the air crisp, the grass damp with dew, and the horizon painted in soft hues of gold and rose. She sat with her elbows resting on her knees, her hands folded loosely. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence between us was different now, not heavy or uncertain, but calm, like we'd both decided there was nothing to prove. Finally, she exhaled, her breath fogging slightly in the morning chill. "You know," she said quietly, "when I told you I wasn't helpless, I meant it. I still do. I nodded, turning toward her. I know. Her eyes softened. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that letting you close would make me weak. That people would look at me and think I was grasping at something I didn't deserve. And maybe I let that fear control me for too long. Her words hung in the cool air, and I could hear the vulnerability beneath them, not defeat, but honesty. She glanced down, tracing a line across the porch wood with her finger. I may be lonely sometimes, she went on, her voice steady. But I'm not helpless. And I'm not foolish either. I don't need rescuing. What I do need, she hesitated, then lifted her gaze back to mine, is someone who doesn't see me as a burden, or a rumor, or a mistake. Someone who just sees me. Her words struck me deeper than I could admit. Slowly, I reached across the space between us, my hand brushing against hers. She didn't move at first, but she didn't pull away either. Her skin was cool from the morning air, but as our fingers intertwined, warmth spread between us, quiet and certain. I see you, I said softly. She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. It wasn't dazzling or dramatic, but it was the kind of smile that carried trust, the kind you only give when you've decided to let someone in. The sun crept higher, spilling light across the porch, catching the curve of her cheek, the strands of hair that framed her face. She leaned slightly against me, her shoulder brushing mine. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a decision. We didn't talk about the future in detail, or make promises we couldn't yet keep. What we had in that moment was enough, two people choosing, quietly and deliberately, not to walk away. As the town slowly stirred awake around us, the distant hum of a car, the bark of a dog down the street, she let out a gentle sigh and whispered, "Maybe I don't have to face it all alone anymore." I squeezed her hand lightly, my chest tightening with a mix of relief and something deeper. And so, on that porch, in the first light of day, the story of us stopped being a question and became something real. Not loud, not flashy, not the kind of love that demands attention, but steady, earned, and ours.